Hello and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist Amanda Bowen. As always, you can see at the bottom of our screen, we have the best ways for you to either contact us or get a forecast outside of our show. You can call our forecast line 24 hours a day, 1-800-472-0391. If you have internet access, you can get us and a forecast online at weather.gov/Alaska. And if you have any feedback or comments for us, feel free to email nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov. We don't have any watches, warnings, or advisories in effect for the land areas of Alaska right now, so we will go ahead and get into our satellite imagery. We have a low pressure system in the eastern Aleutians that's swirling down there, and a weaker low that is swirling just south of the southern panhandle. But mostly what we see is dry weather and clear skies across the mainland. As we look at our surface chart for today, we've got that 979 millibar low there over the eastern Aleutians and southern Alaska Peninsula. That's going to be bringing some rain and snow mix into the Alaska Peninsula as well as the Aleutians and much of the Bering Sea. We'll also see windy conditions for those areas. I know there was a wind gust up to about 63 miles per hour. It was, I believe, closer to the western Aleutians with this system yesterday. That system will continue to weaken as we go forward in time. Today, we're also seeing, again, that weaker low pressure system south of the panhandle, maybe bringing some light rain into the southernmost tip of the panhandle itself. But otherwise, we're seeing those dry and mostly clear conditions across the state. We've got some freezing fog across the north slope, but plenty of sun for most of the state. Heading into tonight, that low pressure system not really moving anywhere, but weakening at least over the eastern Aleutians and southern Alaska Peninsula. That's going to continue to bring a mix of rain and snow showers to the area, as well as some breezy conditions. We'll continue to see freezing fog along the north slope. Remember, that means that any of those really fine fog droplets can freeze on contact with any sort of vehicle or any especially metal surface. So bringing a little bit of an ice glaze to anything it touches, essentially. We'll see some clouds moving into the panhandle tonight and maybe some rain or snow showers across the southernmost portion of the panhandle, but again, mostly dry across the state tonight. As we head into Tuesday, not a whole lot of change. We've still got freezing fog in the forecast for the north slope. We've still got our low pressure system over the southern Alaska Peninsula, bringing some rain and snow mixed to that area. And we've still got dry conditions over much of the mainland. The exception is going to be some snow showers over the Wrangell St. Elias Mountains and continuing with a few rain showers possibly over the southernmost panhandle. Even as we head into Wednesday, we see a little bit of change. We're looking at some snow potentially moving into the southern third of the mainland, mostly north and west of the Alaska Range, but still dry and sunny conditions from about the Alaska Range north. We do see our next strong low pressure system coming into the western Aleutians on Wednesday. That's going to be bringing mostly a rain snow mix as well as some windy conditions with it. Looking at temperatures for Tuesday morning for the kind of southern southeastern portion of the state, we are looking at lows in the upper 20s and 30s for the panhandle, and we're looking at mid to upper 20s for most of south central, 23 for Talkeetna. We've got 36 there for Kodiak on Tuesday morning. Tuesday afternoon will be warming into the 40s with even a a couple of 50s down there in the southern panhandle, but mainly mid 40s, 45 at Yakutat, 45 at Anchorage, and 45 at Homer for Tuesday afternoon. Wednesday morning, pretty similar to Tuesday morning. We do see a couple of warmer low temperatures for the southern panhandle as those clouds and rain chances start to move in again, precluding some more of that cooling overnight. So temperatures in the mid to upper 30s there, but otherwise we're seeing upper 20s to low 30s for the northern panhandle as well as south central and the Alaska Peninsula. For Wednesday afternoon, warming a little bit more for the southern panhandle. We've got mid 50s there, 54 to 57, and some 50s is for the northern panhandle as well. 50 there for Haines on Wednesday afternoon. Still in the 40s for south central and the Alaska Peninsula on Wednesday. Switching to the northern half of the state for low temperatures Tuesday morning, we've got lows just below zero for the North Slope, -1 to -3. Across the interior, we've got double digits, at least in the teens. We've got 19 at Fairbanks and 10 degrees there at Fort Yukon. And then for the West Coast, we are looking at 20s with 23 there at Nome. For Tuesday afternoon, warming quite a bit across the interior into the mid 40s, almost as warm or just as warm really as the southern portion of the state. For the North Slope, we'll be seeing double digits, 13 at Utqiagvik. And for the West Coast, anywhere from the upper 20s to low 30s along the Bering Strait to as high as about 40 there for Nome and 39 at Emonic. Wednesday morning, a similar story. We've got negative single digits for the North Slope and positive teens mostly for the interior with 20s along the West Coast. We've got colder temperatures along the north side of the Seward Peninsula with some of that northerly flow bringing in colder air from the north. And Wednesday afternoon, once again warming into the 40s across the interior and near 40 for much of the West Coast, with the exception of the Chukchi Seacoast. We're looking at highs in the upper 20s, and then lower single digit or lower double digits, I should say, to the teens for the North Slope on Wednesday afternoon. And for the southwestern portion of the state, we're going back to Tuesday morning low temperatures. We've got 20s across the interior with around 30 near the Bristol Bay coast, as well as the YK Delta areas, 31 there in Bethel. And then even a little bit warmer as usual across the Aleutians. We've got mid 30s for the Aleutians. Heading into Tuesday afternoon, warming into the mid 40s as we saw across the interior as well as south central for Tuesday afternoon. A little bit cooler right along the coast. We've got 35 there at Macoriac, and upper 40s is our warm spot with 48 there at King Salmon. For the Aleutians, looking at upper 30s to low 40s. As usual, not a lot of change for the Aleutians between the overnight lows and the afternoon high temperatures. Looking at Wednesday morning, not a ton of change, maybe a couple of degrees warmer for the southwestern interior, 31 there at Bethel, 30 at King Salmon. Still looking at mostly mid 30s for the Aleutians, maybe a couple of degrees cooler with a couple of spots touching freezing for Wednesday morning. And finally, Wednesday afternoon, once again, temperatures rising into the 40s, well into the 40s for most places. We are looking at our warm spot. Once again, King Salmon, 49 degrees. So we could actually see a few spots hit 50 degrees on Wednesday afternoon, certainly continuing to melt any of that snow that's left. And we'll see temperatures a little bit cooler right along the coast, 35 there on Nunivak Island at Macoriac. We'll see some precipitation moving into those areas, which is going to be start keeping the temperatures down a little bit more. As we look further down the Alaska Peninsula, we see 40s there as well, with upper 30s to around 40 for the Aleutians. Moving into our extended outlook for temperatures, this is for April 24th through 28th, so we're looking at mostly next week. We've got an increased chance for warmer than usual temperatures for the southwestern portion of the state and into south central. And then for on the precipitation side, that same area, southwestern Alaska all the way through south central, also favoring drier than usual conditions. The rest of the state, there's not really a good signal for this time period, but again, for the southwestern portion of the state, we're looking at leaning towards a little bit warmer and a little bit drier than usual for next week.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to a look at your aviation forecast, starting with flying weather for Tuesday morning. Mostly VFR conditions across the entire state. The exception is the Aleutians and the southern portion of the Alaska Peninsula, where we'll have some IFR conditions for Tuesday morning. Also some MVFR conditions potentially across portions of southwest Alaska and the very far northeastern corner up on the north slope. For Tuesday afternoon, we see some improvement in those couple of areas of MVFR across the mainland, with a little bit of MVFR developing right over the Wrangell St. Elias Mountains. We also see some improvement in the eastern Aleutians and southern Alaska Peninsula, where we're looking at MVFR, which will be an improvement from IFR on Tuesday morning. For Wednesday morning, still mostly VFR across the state. We do have some IFR developing right along the north slope from east of Utqiagvik, and then IFR also developing in the western Aleutians, with some MVFR hanging around for the eastern Aleutians and some MVFR developing in the higher terrain in the Panhandle. For Wednesday afternoon, improvement for almost the entirety of the mainland and the peninsula to VFR conditions. We do see a little bit of MVFR developing right along the YK Delta area and Nunivak Island, and then IFR conditions spreading into the central and eastern Aleutians for Wednesday afternoon. Pass conditions, as you can imagine, for Tuesday looking almost entirely VFR. Both Anaktuvik Pass and Adigan Pass both looking VFR on Tuesday. Lake Clark Pass, Merrill Pass, and Rainy Passes all VFR on Tuesday. Windy Pass, Isabel Pass, and Mentasta Pass all VFR on Tuesday. Tanita Pass and Portage Pass also VFR conditions for Tuesday. The only exception that we have is Chilkoot and White Passes, which may see some MVFR conditions Tuesday afternoon. So starting the day out VFR Tuesday morning, potentially developing to MVFR conditions at Chilkoot and White Passes Tuesday afternoon. As we look at our freezing levels for Tuesday morning, our surface freezing level is going through the central Bering into the Bristol Bay area, across the area near the Barrens and across the North Gulf and into the coastal Panhandle area. Then we have just a little bit of warmer air coming into the Panhandle area with freezing level there around 2,000 feet as well. For icing on Tuesday, a couple of areas of isolated moderate icing, both for the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians, spreading up into the Bering up to about St. Lawrence Island. That's going to be isolated moderate icing above 2,000 feet. And then also for the western Aleutians, isolated moderate icing above 2,000 feet. As we look at our flight level winds, very high up with the jet stream level, we have our jet is associated with a low pressure in the Central Pacific, so the strongest winds arcing up over the Aleutians, peaking south of the Aleutians at about 145 knots out of the north and northwest. As we come down in height at 9,000 feet, we have our strongest winds in that same area, kind of the eastern or central Aleutians, and just south of there, we've got some northerly winds up to about 60 knots. But over the most part of the state, pretty low level winds or pretty calm winds, with winds peaking out of the east at about 25 knots across the central interior. And at 3,000 feet, once again, our strongest winds over the eastern Aleutians, 40 to 65 knots out of the north. And then we also have some increased winds to about 35 knots out of the east for the Alaska Peninsula on the north side of that low pressure system. Finally, for turbulence, with all of our activity happening in the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, that is also going to be where we're focused for turbulence on Tuesday. So we do have, for the eastern Aleutians, some isolated severe turbulence possible on Tuesday. That's going to be from the surface to about 4,000 feet. And then stretching all the way from Bristol Bay down the Alaska Peninsula and almost all the way out the Aleutians. We're looking at the possibility for some considerable moderate turbulence towards the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutians. That's going to be between the surface and about 4,000 feet. And further west in the western Aleutians, we're looking at that considerable moderate turbulence between the surface and 3,000 feet. Stay tuned for more Alaska weather after this.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, joined again by Eric Stevens of GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Eric, thanks so much for joining us again tonight.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks, Eric. And we've been talking about the complex gathering of information from satellites, looking down on the surface of the planet, and some of those orbits around the planet work for Alaska, and some of them don't. There's a lot of challenges with those. How can we get better imagery for the poles and specifically for Alaska?
Right. Well, today we're going to talk about a very interesting kind of satellite orbit that has potential to be real helpful for the high latitudes.
Okay.
Especially us here in Alaska. Canadians, Russians, Norwegians will all be interested in this. The satellites are not in orbit yet. Now the future is uncertain, but it's possible, and if this happens, it will be wonderful for Alaska. Okay. It's called the highly elliptical orbit.
Oh, that sounds
it's interesting. Yeah. And I think first, to help our discussion, we should get back to some of Kepler's laws and how do satellites work.
Sure.
Kepler's first law, an orbit of a planet around a sun or a weather satellite around the Earth is not necessarily a circle, it's an ellipse.
Okay.
And the highly elliptical orbit takes advantage of this aspect. We're going to put the Earth in one of the ellipse and then stretch one of the foci of the ellipse and then stretch that ellipse out real far to make it highly elliptical.
The foci is that bend part of the end of the ellipse. If you're going to stretch out a rubber band, that would be the center, kind of the stretchy part.
Yes.
Ends. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then Kepler's second law says that the closer something is to the thing that it's orbiting, the faster it goes.
Okay.
We see this in the solar system, that Mercury flies around the sun real fast. Jupiter, much slower. Jupiter's further away, it's slower. Mercury's closer in, it's faster. This happens with weather satellites too. Even satellites like the International Space Station, it's pretty close to the Earth. It goes around the Earth in only 90 minutes. That thing is moving. It's only 250 miles away. So how can we take advantage of these two aspects of Kepler's laws of motion to get better weather surveillance of Alaska? And this highly elliptical orbit is going to be the approach. So we have with us today our friendly planet Earth and our simulated satellite, the lid off of this salt shaker
like
here.
Sputnik there. Yeah.
There it is. It's shiny, it's metal, it's space worthy. And what we want to be able to do is, could you have a satellite hover over the top of the world, up over Alaska? You can't really do that. Geostationary satellites have to be over the equator. Okay. So how could we almost solve this? And this is the tricky part. Maybe should we tilt the Earth over?
Focus on the pole. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, right?
So here we have the northern side of the planet, and we're going to trace out the orbit of a satellite with this salt shaker lid here. Now imagine a highly elliptical orbit. So let's put the Earth in one of the foci of the ellipse, and we'll have an imaginary foci out here. So the satellite will not go in a circle around the Earth, but will be in this long strung out ellipse. So the satellite will go...
kind of like a racetrack.
Yes, there you go, like a racetrack. So it's an oval elliptical shape like that. And notice now that when the satellite's over here, we've got a nice view of the northern hemisphere around. There's Alaska, Russia, Canada, Greenland, all there. So that's the ellipse aspect of an orbit, Kepler's first law. The second law saying that when you're further away as a satellite, you go slower. And this we can take real advantage of. Because the way this orbit works, when the satellite goes over Antarctica here, it's going to be close to the Earth. It's going to be moving, whoosh, goes on by. And then as it comes out here, it will slow down. This increases what is known as the dwell time. The satellite will just hang here looking for hours at Alaska and the high Arctic. And then eventually it will come around and it will accelerate and whiz around the South Pole and then come back and hang here for a while because it's further away from the planet. It goes slower. It has to. That's the laws of motion. And such like that, repeating.
Wow.
Now, the real important way to make this work is you have to have two satellites. So that while one is whipping around the pole, you've got the other one out here, and they work as a team. You could then get a series of images of Alaska that can be almost from a constant frame of reference, and you can loop them together to make movies. You can take a picture every 10 minutes, say, of Alaska, and then loop it, playing it at several frames a second. You could see the clouds whiz on by. You know, the Weather Channel, weather broadcasters in the lower 48 especially can show these movie loops from the geostationary satellites. In Alaska, we've never really been able to do that very well, especially in the higher, most northern parts of the state, because those geostationary satellites are over the equator. It's not a good view. And this highly elliptical orbit whipping around the South Pole and then dwelling up here would be a way for us to get that constant frame of reference and do really good weather surveillance over the Arctic, seeing where those storms are, where they're going. Nothing quite like a movie loop of the weather in time to really illustrate what's important, what's going on.
And compared to what we have right now, we just have small windows or snapshots of what's going on with the polar orbiters. We don't have that long range view that's looking top down to give us that complete motion picture that helps us understand so much of the atmosphere at this
There's
point.
so many different kinds of satellites. Each has their advantage. Each is important, and the highly elliptical orbit satellite will also fit into that scheme. It's a nifty idea to solve an Alaskan challenge.
That's fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. And again, kind of a satellite dream of the future to come. Okay, very good. Thanks for joining us today, Eric. We really appreciate the information. And if you'd like to learn more about what Eric does at GINA, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we invite you to visit the web address that you see on your screen there. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to a look at your marine forecast, starting with the sea ice edge. That sea ice edge continues to shift back northward with that southerly winds that have been coming into the Bering Sea with those Bering Sea storms. So that ice edge moving further away from St. Paul Island, whereas last week it was still mostly encapsulating St. Paul Island. So some quick retreat of the sea ice as well as decreases in the concentration, with more of that area looking at the less than 80% concentration. Moving on to our marine forecast for winds and seas, looking at southeast for Tuesday, we've got generally easterly flow across the eastern Gulf with winds 15 to 20 knots, seas 6 to 7 feet. We've got some northerly flow across the inside waterways, 20 to 25 knots, with about 4 to 5 foot seas there. For Wednesday, we will see the seas coming up, but the winds continuing to be out of the east at 15 to 25 knots for the Gulf. Seas all the way up to 10 to 14 feet for the eastern Gulf, though. We'll also see some gusty winds across the inside waterways, particularly the northern inside waterways, with gusts out of the north and northeast to about 35 knots as we see some of those outflow winds. For Tuesday across South Central, we're looking at winds kind of light and variable across Prince William Sound and the northwestern Gulf, 10 knots there, but winds as high as 20 to 25 knots with easterly flow through the area near the Barren Islands. Seas across the board 5 to about 7 feet, with 3 feet in Cook Inlet and 2 feet in Prince William Sound. As we head into Wednesday across South Central, still kind of light and variable winds, a lot of 10 knots around with variable directions. The areas that do have a more concentrated wind direction are looking at flow generally out of the north and northwest. Winds as high as about 15 knots in some areas. Seas coming down, particularly in the area around the Barings, to about 2 feet, looking at 5 to as much as 9 feet possibly for the northern Gulf. Tuesday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas, we've got some gale force winds out of the east up to 35 knots. We'll see seas coming up with that to 13 to 19 feet. That's mostly going to be impacting the southern portion of the Alaska Peninsula. As we go further north towards Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay, winds a little bit less strong, still small craft advisory level though, 25 to 30 knots out of the east. Wednesday, for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas, we see a significant shift with both winds and seas coming down. Winds just 10 to 15 knots, still kind of generally out of the east. Seas coming down to just 3 to 6 feet on the Bering Sea side and 11 to 13 feet on the Gulf side. For Tuesday along the Aleutian chain, we've got our strongest winds, storm force winds near the eastern Aleutians as that low pressure continues to churn right in that area. So 50 knots of wind out of the west and northwest with seas 22 to 24 feet around the eastern Aleutians. As we head west towards western Aleutians, we'll see those winds and seas decreasing quite a bit. 20 to 30 knots of wind, so still significant, but a lot less than those storm force winds elsewhere, and seas 10 to 13 feet for the western Aleutians. Wednesday, things kind of switch around a little bit as that low over the eastern Aleutians decreases significantly. We'll see winds switching to easterly flow, 25 to about 35 knots, with seas coming down to 8 to 9 feet. And then we'll see winds and seas both start to pick up as our next system starts to move into the western Aleutians. We're looking at easterly and northeasterly flow, 40 to 45 knots of wind, and seas up to about 17 feet. Tuesday for the west coast, we've got northeasterly flow, 15 to 20 knots with some higher winds off the Kuskokwim Delta, 30 knots there and 25 knots near the Pribilofs. As we head into Wednesday, we'll see those winds come down to about 10 knots, peaking around 20 knots out of the east near the Pribilofs. And for the Arctic coast, we're looking at 10 to 15 knots out of the east and northeast on Tuesday, as well as 10 to 15 knots on Wednesday. For tonight, recapping, we've got that strong low pressure system that's going to be bringing some strong winds, large seas, and some rain and snow mix to the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. Thanks so much for watching Alaska TV Weather.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.